May 18, 1940, 11 kilometers south of Sedan, the Meuse River Valley. The blood pooled warm beneath Pierre Dutoit's left shoulder blade, soaking through his tunic in a spreading darkness that he couldn't see but felt with absolute certainty. The explosion had come from nowhere, a Stuka's scream, then the earth erupting in fire and steel. And now he lay face down in a roadside ditch, breathing in the smell of torn grass and cordite, while his legs refused to answer his commands. 23 years old, a corporal in the 147th Fortress Infantry Regiment, and he was dying in a drainage culvert with muddy water seeping into his boots. He had imagined death differently. Cleaner, perhaps, more dignified. Not this slow drowning in his own fluids, while the world above continued its mechanical devastation. The sound of boots, German boots he knew from their rhythm, approached along the road. Pierre tried to move, managed only to shift his cheek deeper into the mud. His rifle lay 3 meters away, impossibly distant. He waited for the bullet that would end it. That's what soldiers did to the wounded enemy, wasn't it? Practical, efficient. The propaganda posters in Rams had shown Wehrmacht troops bayoneting French prisoners, their faces twisted in Teutonic savagery. Hier drüben, lebt noch. Hands, surprisingly gentle, rolled him onto his back. The sky above was smoke gray, streaked with the contrails of aircraft that looked like scratch marks on a photograph. A face appeared, young, perhaps younger than Pierre himself, with pale blue eyes and a dusting of stubble across his jaw. The German soldier shouted something over his shoulder, then pressed both hands against Pierre's shoulder, and the pain that followed was so absolute that consciousness flickered like a candle in wind. 2 months earlier, Pierre Dutoit had stood in formation at Sedan's Fortress Sector headquarters, listening to Captain Moreau explain why the German army would never break through the Ardennes. It was impossible, the captain said. The forest was too dense, the roads too narrow, the fortifications too strong. The Maginot Line extended its steel fingers deep into the earth here. Belgium's neutrality protected the north, and behind them stretched the industrial might of France, a nation that had bled Germany white just 22 years ago. They will come, Moreau had said, his voice carrying across the assembled company, and they will break themselves against us like waves against a cliff. The men had believed him because believing was easier than the alternative. France had won the last war. France had the largest army in Europe. France had modern artillery, excellent defensive positions, and, most importantly, the moral clarity of fighting on home soil against an aggressor. The recruits from Provence and Normandy, from Alsace and Brittany, they all carried the same certainty in their packs, alongside the regulation 52 cartridges and 2 days' rations. Pierre himself came from a small village near Verdun, where his father still walked with a limp from the previous war's gas attacks. The old man had wept when Pierre received his mobilization papers, but his words had been fierce. Make them pay for every meter, boy. Make them remember. On the 10th of May, when the offensive began, Pierre had been eating breakfast, stale bread and weak coffee, in a concrete bunker that smelled of mildew and unwashed men. The initial reports seemed almost comical, German paratroopers dressed as nuns, falling from the sky into Belgium, gliders landing silently on top of fortresses. It was absurd, theatrical, the kind of thing that happened in pulp adventure novels, not real warfare. Then the radio traffic changed. The words came faster, higher pitched, frantic with disbelief. Panzers in the Ardennes, hundreds of them, thousands, pushing through roads that shouldn't support motorcycles, let alone tanks. Air support everywhere, Stukas diving like hawks, pinpoint accurate, devastating. By the 13th of May, the Meuse crossings had begun. Pierre watched from his position as German engineers assembled pontoon bridges under withering French artillery fire, replacing destroyed sections faster than they could be knocked down. The efficiency was terrifying, mechanical, remorseless. These weren't the troops from the propaganda, goose-stepping caricatures in grainy newsreels. These were professionals, executing complex maneuvers with practiced precision while French defensive coordination crumbled like wet paper. The breakthrough came on the 14th. Pierre's unit, meant to counterattack and seal the breach, instead found itself retreating through villages where civilians stood in doorways, watching with hollow eyes as their army fled west. An old woman in Kemery offered him water from a clay jug. Her hands shook as she poured, and she said nothing, but her silence contained an accusation more damning than any words. By the 18th, order had dissolved entirely. Pierre's company, reduced now to 37 men from its original 162, moved through a landscape transformed into apocalypse. Burning vehicles lined the roads, their tires sending oily black smoke into the morning air. Refugees clogged every thoroughfare, pushing carts piled with belongings, carrying children, dragging the elderly. Somewhere an officer was supposed to be coordinating a defensive line. Somewhere reinforcements were supposed to be arriving. Somewhere France was supposed to be winning. The Stuka found them on a straight stretch of road between two villages Pierre couldn't name. The siren, that damn siren, designed specifically to break morale, announced death's arrival 3 seconds before the bombs hit. Pierre dove for the ditch, felt the concussion lift him like a toy, heard the scream that might have been his own, or might have been Private Leclerc, whose legs had been attached to his body just moments before. Then, mud, blood, the approaching boots. The German medic, his name tag read Obergefreiter Koch, worked with efficient speed, cutting away Pierre's tunic, pressing field dressings against wounds that Pierre couldn't see. Another soldier appeared with a stretcher. They spoke in rapid German medical terminology that Pierre's schoolboy lessons couldn't parse, and then he was being lifted, carried, moving. He expected summary execution. He expected a bullet in a ditch, an unmarked grave, the disappearance that befell countless prisoners in countless wars. The propaganda had been clear. The Germans were monsters, subhuman barbarians who would show no mercy to captured enemies. Instead, they brought him to a field hospital. The shock of it froze his mind more completely than any cold. The hospital occupied what had been a French aid station 3 hours earlier. Sandbags still bore tricolor markings, though swastika flags now flew from improvised poles. Inside, organized chaos. Wounded men on stretchers, doctors in blood-smeared smocks, nurses moving with purposeful haste. The surprise wasn't the efficiency. Pierre had expected German efficiency. The surprise was that half the wounded were French. A German doctor, perhaps 40 years old with wire-rimmed spectacles, in surgeon's hands, examined Pierre's shoulder with professional detachment. He spoke to Koch in German, then switched to accented but clear French. The shrapnel has missed your lung by perhaps 2 centimeters. You are very lucky. We operate now, yes? Otherwise, you bleed internally and die by morning. Pierre, swimming in shock and blood loss, could only nod. Good, you will sleep. When you wake, you will hurt very much, but you will live. An anesthetic mass descended. Pierre tried to form words, questions, protests, something, but consciousness faded into chemical darkness. He woke to pain that proved the surgeon's promise accurate. His shoulder blazed with white-hot agony that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. But he was alive, breathing, and he could move his fingers. The recovery tent housed perhaps 50 wounded men, arranged in 2 rows with German efficiency. Pierre lay between a French lieutenant with bandaged eyes and a German corporal whose left leg ended at the knee. An orderly, another German, barely old enough to shave, moved down the row offering water, adjusting bandages, speaking in broken French to the French soldiers and German to his own countrymen with the same neutral professionalism. The lieutenant, whose name was Arnaud, whispered bitterly, "They saved us so they'd have prisoners to parade, propaganda for their newsreels." But the elderly German in the next bed, a sergeant with shrapnel wounds across his back, overheard and responded in surprisingly good French. "The doctor operated on you because you would die otherwise. This is medicine, not propaganda. War makes enough corpses without doctors adding more." The conversation revealed fractures in Pierre's understanding. The German sergeant had fought in the previous war, had been gassed at Ipsy just like Pierre's father, carried the same permanent cough. The French captain 3 beds down had been treated by the same German surgeon who'd saved Pierre, receiving a blood transfusion from a German soldier because they shared the same type. The line between enemy and enemy blurred in this space of shared suffering. But outside the tent, the war continued its mechanical progression. Through the canvas, Pierre could hear the rumble of vehicles moving west, always west. The German advance seemed unstoppable, inevitable, a force of nature rather than a military operation. France was falling, not in glorious battle but in systematic, humiliating collapse. On his third day of consciousness, a German major visited the tent, inspecting the wounded with bureaucratic thoroughness. He paused at Pierre's bed, checked the chart hanging from the frame, nodded with satisfaction. Through an interpreter, he explained that Pierre would be transported to a prisoner camp in Germany once he could travel. It was said matter-of-factly, without triumph or cruelty, just a statement of logistical fact. Pierre found his voice, hoarse from disuse. "Why did you save me?" The major looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "You were wounded. We are doctors and soldiers, not murderers." He said it as if the distinction were obvious, self-evident, requiring no further explanation. After he left, Lieutenant Arnaud laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "They save us, then cage us. German efficiency." But Pierre couldn't share the lieutenant's cynicism. Something fundamental had fractured in his understanding of the world. He had been taught, through posters, through speeches, through the casual racism of military culture, that Germans were different, less human, capable of atrocities that civilized Frenchmen would never commit. The propaganda had drawn clear lines, us and them, good and evil, human and monster. The reality was far more destabilizing. The doctor who'd saved his life had done so with the same professional dedication Pierre's own father gave to repairing watches in their village shop. The orderlies who changed his dressings showed the same weary competence as French medics. The wounded German soldiers groaned in the same language of pain that transcended nationality. They were, and this was the thought that kept Pierre awake through morphine-hazed nights, they were just men, organized differently, serving different flags, speaking different languages, but men nonetheless. Men who could show mercy even to enemies. Men who could maintain professional standards even in the chaos of conquest. It was terrifying in a way that battle never had been. Battle confirmed everything the propaganda promised. Chaos, violence, the clear distinction between shooting and being shot. But this mercy, this unexpected humanity, demolished the simple categories that made war comprehensible. If Germans could be decent, what did that say about the French failure? If the enemy showed mercy, what did that reveal about French assumptions of moral superiority? On the 22nd of June, news reached the hospital tent that France had signed an armistice. The war, France's war, was over. It had lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks to destroy the largest army in Europe, to conquer a nation that had withstood 4 years of German assault in the previous war, to render meaningless every patriotic speech and propaganda poster that Pierre had believed. The French soldiers received the news in near silence. A few wept. Most simply stared at nothing, processing the impossible mathematics of total defeat. 6 weeks, 42 days, from the 10th of May to the 22nd of June, and France had ceased to exist as a military power. The German soldiers, by contrast, seemed almost subdued. There were no celebrations, no triumphant demonstrations. They continued their duties with the same professional detachment they'd shown throughout. Perhaps they were simply exhausted. Perhaps victory, when it came so completely and so quickly, lost its celebratory flavor. Pierre's shoulder healed slowly. By mid-July, he could move his arm with only moderate pain. The scar tissue pulled when he reached above his head, a permanent reminder of the 18th of May and everything that followed. He was transferred, along with 200 other French prisoners, to a camp near Nuremberg where they would spend the next several years. The train journey gave him his first comprehensive view of the conquered territory. France looked smaller from a prisoner train, somehow diminished even though the landscape remained unchanged. Villages passed in succession, their names familiar from school geography lessons, but now marked with German signs, patrolled by German soldiers, integrated into the new order with disturbing efficiency. In the camp, Pierre shared a barrack with 30 other French soldiers. They told stories to pass the time, reconstructing their experiences of those 42 days, trying to understand how defeat had come so swiftly and so completely. The explanations varied: superior German tactics, French command incompetence, the failure of Allied coordination, the shock of Blitzkrieg warfare against defenders trained for static combat, poor intelligence, better German aircraft, the moral collapse that follows unexpected catastrophe. All true, perhaps, all inadequate to explain the magnitude of the failure. But Pierre kept returning to that moment in the ditch, when German hands had pressed against his wounds to stop the bleeding. That moment of unexpected mercy had revealed something the propaganda never acknowledged, that wars weren't fought between good and evil, but between organizations of human beings who could be professional or cruel, merciful or murderous, depending on circumstances and choices that transcended national identity. Lieutenant Arnaud, who ended up in the same camp, maintained his bitter cynicism. They saved you so they'd have workers. Everything the Germans do serves a purpose. Maybe, probably, but Pierre couldn't fully accept that explanation. The doctor who'd operated on him hadn't needed to be so careful, hadn't needed to use his limited anesthetic supply on an enemy soldier, hadn't needed to check on Pierre's recovery with genuine professional interest. Those were choices that exceeded mere pragmatism. The war continued, of course, though France's active participation had ended. Through the camp's limited news, German newspapers, occasional Red Cross bulletins, rumors from new prisoners, Pierre followed the conflict's expansion. Britain stood alone. The Soviet Union entered the war. America eventually. The maps in Pierre's mind grew more complex, the calculations more difficult. He would survive the war, 4.5 years as a prisoner, working in German factories, enduring cold and hunger and boredom, but never the brutality the propaganda had promised. He would return to France in 1945 to find his village intact, but his father dead, the old man's gas-damaged lungs finally failing during the winter of '43. He would rebuild, marry, father children, work as a teacher in the same school where he'd once learned that Germans were monsters and France was invincible. He would carry the scar on his shoulder until his death in 1998, at the age of 81, in a world where France and Germany were allies, partners in a European project built on the ruins of the conflicts that had nearly destroyed them both. But in the long nights of his captivity, and in the decades that followed, Pierre would return again and again to that moment in the ditch. To the German hands pressing against his wounds, to the surgeon who'd saved an enemy's life without hesitation, to the fundamental destabilizing truth that humans could extend mercy even across the clearest lines of enmity. The propaganda had been wrong about so much: French invincibility, German monstrosity, the certainty of moral categories in war. But its deepest lie had been the simplest: that enemies were different enough to deserve death without question, that the uniform made the man, rather than the man wearing the uniform. Pierre had fallen in France in May of 1940, not just physically, but philosophically. The fall had shattered more than his shoulder. It had broken the simple certainties that made war comprehensible. What rose in their place was harder to live with: the recognition that mercy and cruelty, professionalism and atrocity could coexist within the same army, the same nation, the same human heart. France had fallen in 42 days, but Pierre's understanding of what that fall meant would take a lifetime to fully comprehend. The scar tissue on his shoulder healed in months. The scar tissue on his certainties never fully knit. And perhaps in the end, that was the truest legacy of those 6 weeks when the world turned inside out and revealed that enemies, like friends, were far more complicated than any propaganda could acknowledge. The German doctor had saved him because medicine demanded it, because professional pride demanded it, because, and this was what haunted Pierre most, some essential human decency demanded it, even in the midst of conquest and collapse. That mercy hadn't ended the war, hadn't changed France's fate, hadn't altered the historical trajectory in any measurable way. But it had changed Pierre Dutoit. It had transformed his understanding of what humans could be to each other, even when every social structure insisted they should be enemies. And in the quiet accumulation of such small transformations, multiply Pierre by millions across all nations, through all wars, perhaps lay the only hope for a species that seemed determined to periodically tear itself apart and yet somehow, inexplicably, kept choosing mercy when mercy made no strategic sense. May 18, 1940. A man fell in a ditch and expected death. What he received instead was more complicated, more challenging, more human than any propaganda could encompass. And in that gap between expectation and reality, between the war as imagined and the war as lived, lay the terrible, necessary truth that wars are fought by people, not principles, and people are capable of surprising themselves with both their cruelty and their grace.